Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Earth defense vessel Vanguard and watched the stars through the main view screen like he had done 1,000 times before. But tonight something felt different in the air, and he could not explain why his crew moved about their stations with practiced ease, running diagnostics and monitoring deep space for any signs of trouble. But there had never been any trouble in the 300 years humanity had been exploring space, because they were alone, or so everyone believed until tonight, when everything humanity thought they knew about the universe would change forever, and the nightmares that lived in ancient stories would prove to be more than just tales told to scare children. In the dark, Lieutenant Amy Sanders sat at the communication station, and her fingers danced across the holographic controls as she tried to make sense of the signal that had appeared 2 days ago from the Kepler system. And at first she thought it was just background noise or maybe a malfunction in their equipment, but the pattern was too complex and too organized to be anything natural, and she had spent every waking hour since then trying to decode it while surviving on coffee and determination. And now as she looked at the translation matrix, her blood ran cold, because this was not a greeting from some friendly alien civilization reaching out across the stars to say hello and welcome to the cosmic community, but rather a warning telling anyone who could hear to run and hide because something terrible was coming, and it was already too late to escape. Chief Engineer Lucas Hayes monitored the engine readings from his station near the back of the bridge, and everything looked normal with the reactor running at optimal efficiency and the shields holding steady at full power. But then his console started flashing red warnings that made no sense at all, because the sensors were detecting gravitational anomalies appearing in empty space around their position, and the readings showed impossible mass signatures that should not exist according to every law of physics he had ever studied in all his years of training and experience. And he called out to the captain with urgency in his voice that something massive was entering their space, and whatever it was did not belong in their reality. The view screen suddenly filled with blinding light that made everyone shield their eyes, and when they could see again, the stars were gone, and in their place were tears in space itself, like wounds in the fabric of reality, bleeding darkness into the normal universe, and from those wounds came ships, but calling them ships was wrong, because they were alive in some horrible way with metal and flesh merged together in designs that hurt to look at, and they pulsed with sickly green light that made everyone who saw them feel sick to their stomach, and behind the ships came creatures that moved through the void of space without any protection, as if vacuum was no different than air, and their forms were massive and terrible and wrong in every possible way. Lieutenant Commander Rachel Stone managed the tactical systems, and her training took over, even as her mind struggled to process what she was seeing, because these things should not exist, and yet they were there right in front of her. And she started running threat assessments and calculating firing solutions, but the computer kept giving error messages because it had no reference data for anything like these monsters, and she whispered the words that everyone on the bridge was thinking when she said that the myths were real, and all those old stories about dragons and demons and creatures from beyond were not made up, but were memories of something that had happened long ago when humanity was young and did not have words to properly describe the horrors they had witnessed. Jake had studied ancient legends as a hobby because he found them fascinating and entertaining, but he never imagined they might be true. And now, as he looked at the creatures attacking his ship, he recognized them from 1,000 different cultures and 1,000 different names. But they were all describing the same things, and these beings had visited Earth before in the distant past, when humans were still learning to make fire and speak in complete sentences, and they had left such an impression of terror that the memory was passed down through generations in stories and warnings that became myths and legends that modern people dismissed as primitive superstition. The Vanguard shook violently as unknown weapons struck the shields, and energy readings spiked off the charts, and damage reports started flooding in from all sections of the ship, and Jake knew they were in serious trouble because nothing in their arsenal was designed to fight living ships and space monsters that should not exist. And he gripped the arms of his command chair and forced himself to stay calm because his crew needed him to be strong and make the right decisions, even when every instinct screamed at him to run as far and fast as possible away from these things. He activated the ship-wide intercom, and his voice echoed through every corridor and room on the Vanguard as he ordered all hands to battle stations and told them to prepare for combat against an unknown enemy. And then he opened a priority channel to Earth Command, because someone needed to warn them that humanity was no longer alone in the universe, and that the company they had finally found was the worst possible kind. And these creatures called the Draketh by civilizations that no longer existed had been sealed away by an ancient race millions of years ago. But somehow the seals were failing, and the galaxy's greatest nightmare was waking up hungry and angry after its long imprisonment. Amy worked frantically at her station trying to boost the signal strength so the warning message would reach Earth before the Draketh jammed their communications, and she knew this might be the last transmission the Vanguard ever sent, but it had to get through because Earth needed time to prepare, and humanity needed to know what was coming for them. And she encrypted the message with every code she knew, and sent it on every frequency possible, and prayed that someone would receive it and understand the danger. The creatures outside grew bolder and more aggressive, and they surrounded the Vanguard like sharks circling prey, and their weapons tore into the shields with relentless fury, and Jake knew his ship could not survive much longer against this assault, and he had to make a choice between staying to gather more intelligence about these enemies, or running to ensure his crew survived to fight another day. And it was the hardest decision he had ever faced as a captain. But he knew that knowledge was power. And without understanding what they faced, humanity would have no chance at all. Lucas reported that the shields were failing, and reactor power was dropping, and they had maybe 10 minutes before the Draketh broke through their defenses and reached the hull, and once that happened it would be over quickly. And Jake nodded grimly, and ordered all available power redirected to sensors and communications, and if they were going to die here, then they would make sure their deaths meant something, and every piece of data they collected would be sent back to Earth to help those who came after them. The Vanguard's sensors recorded everything about the Draketh ships and creatures, and the data streamed back toward Earth across the vast distances of space, carrying information that would prove vital in the coming war. And as the shields finally collapsed and the monsters closed in, Jake Morrison stood tall on his bridge, surrounded by his loyal crew, and they faced their end together, knowing they had done their duty and warned humanity that the monsters from ancient myths were real and they were coming, and Earth had better be ready for the battle of its life. Commander Lisa Grant stepped off the transport shuttle and onto Orbital Station Olympus, with a sense of dread weighing heavy on her shoulders, because the emergency summit that had been called 3 weeks after the Vanguard's final transmission was unlike anything in human history, and representatives from alien species that humanity did not even know existed were gathering in secret to discuss a threat that had apparently been hunting them across the galaxy for thousands of years. And the fact that these aliens had been hiding in human space without making contact until now told Lisa everything she needed to know about how terrified they were of the Draketh. Ambassador Kevin Rhodes waited for her in the docking bay, and his face showed the strain of sleepless nights spent preparing for negotiations with species whose languages and cultures were completely unknown. And he had been Earth's chief diplomat for 15 years, but nothing in his training had prepared him for this situation, where humanity was the newcomer, trying to convince ancient civilizations to stop running and start fighting, and the weight of potentially billions of lives rested on his ability to find the right words. They walked through the station corridors toward the council chamber, and passed by windows that showed the vast construction yards where Earth's military was working day and night to build more ships and weapons, because even though the Draketh had only destroyed the Vanguard so far, everyone knew that more attacks were coming and humanity needed to be ready, and the orbital yards that had once built exploration vessels and cargo haulers were now churning out warships at a pace that would have seemed impossible just a month ago. The council chamber was a large circular room with holographic projectors arranged around the perimeter, and as Kevin and Lisa entered, they saw 18 different alien species represented through holograms or in person, and the variety of forms was staggering, with some aliens looking almost human, while others were so strange that Lisa had trouble understanding how they could even be alive and function. But what united all of them was the fear she saw in their eyes, or eye equivalents, and these were civilizations that had survived for millennia. But the Draketh had broken their spirits and turned them into refugees hiding in the dark corners of space. A tall crystalline being stepped forward and introduced himself as Veltharos of the Luminari, and his voice sounded like bells chiming in a cathedral, and he explained that his people had been fighting the Draketh for 1,000 years, and had lost more worlds than he could count, and now they survived in hidden colonies and cloaked stations scattered across the galaxy, always moving and never staying in one place long enough for the enemy to find them. and he looked at Kevin with something like pity when he asked why humanity would choose to stand and fight when running had kept the other species alive. Kevin stood at the central podium and felt the weight of all those alien eyes upon him, and he took a deep breath before speaking, and his words were simple but carried conviction when he said that someone had to make a stand because running forever was not living but merely surviving, and he asked Veltheros directly if fleeing had actually saved his people or just delayed their inevitable extinction, and the question hung in the air like an accusation. A reptilian delegate named Sisratha rose from her seat and her voice hissed with barely controlled anger, as she told Kevin that humanity was arrogant and foolish and had only been in space for 3 centuries while her people had been fleeing the Draketh for 3,000 years, and humans could not possibly comprehend the horror of what hunted them or the futility of resistance, and she spoke of worlds consumed and civilizations erased and fleets destroyed in battles that lasted for years and accomplished nothing except delaying the inevitable. Kevin listened respectfully and then said that maybe humanity did not understand the full scope of the threat, but they understood that giving up meant certain death while fighting meant at least a chance at survival. And he admitted that humans might be young and inexperienced, but they had something the older races seemed to have lost, which was the will to hit back when struck, and the refusal to accept defeat as long as breath remained in their bodies. Dr. Henry Blake stepped forward with his data pad and explained that Earth scientists had been studying the biological samples and sensor readings from the Vanguard's last battle, and while the Draketh were certainly powerful and terrifying, they were not invincible gods but rather biological creatures that could be killed. And they used technology that could be analyzed and reverse-engineered, and his voice grew excited as he described potential weaknesses in their organic armor and possible vulnerabilities in their ship's power systems. Veltheros interrupted to explain that the ancients who came before had tried everything and used weapons and technologies far beyond what humanity currently possessed, and even they could not destroy the Draketh completely, which was why they had built the Great Seals to contain the enemy and trap them outside normal space. And those seals had held for millions of years, but now they were failing, and the imprisoned nightmares were breaking free, and soon the galaxy would be overrun. Kevin felt the mood in the chamber sink toward despair, and he knew he had to say something to rally these broken civilizations and give them hope. So he spoke with passion about human history and how his species had faced extinction events before, from ice ages and plagues and wars and natural disasters, and every time they had survived through determination and innovation and adaptation, and yes, many had died, but humanity as a whole had persevered and grown stronger, and now they would apply those same qualities to this new threat. Admiral Claire Foster joined Kevin at the podium, and her military bearing commanded respect as she laid out Earth's defense plans and explained how human forces would coordinate with any allied species willing to share their technology and knowledge. And she spoke of new weapons being developed and new tactics being tested, and new ships being built that combined the best aspects of multiple civilizations' designs, and her confidence was infectious. An elderly alien with 6 arms and wise ancient eyes finally spoke, and his name was Tolmak, and his species called the Architects had built the space stations and stargates that most civilizations now used, and he had lived for over 2,000 years and seen empires rise and fall, and he studied Kevin and Claire with an intensity that made them both uncomfortable. And then he said that humanity was either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish, but perhaps the galaxy needed that kind of reckless courage right now because wisdom and caution had only led to retreat and decline. Ptolemach announced that the Architects would share their preserved knowledge and technologies with Earth and help construct defenses and weapons that might actually hurt the Draketh, and his decision seemed to give courage to the other species, because one by one they began to agree to join the alliance and share what resources they had, and work together for the first time in millennia toward a common goal instead of just trying to save themselves. Lisa watched the mood in the chamber transform from despair to cautious hope, and she marveled at Kevin's diplomatic skills because he had managed to unite fractured civilizations that had given up on cooperation long ago, and now they had a real chance to mount a coordinated defense instead of being picked off one by an enemy that had terrorized the galaxy for longer than human civilization had existed. After the formal session ended, Veltheros approached Kevin privately, and his crystalline face was hard to read, but his voice carried a warning tone when he said that the ambassador should know the full truth about Earth's myths and legends and how the dragons and demons and sea monsters from human folklore were not inventions or symbols, but actual genetic memories passed down through countless generations from a time 100,000 years ago when the Draketh had visited Earth and encountered primitive humans who had no language or technology to fight back. Kevin felt ice run through his veins as he realized the implications and asked if the Draketh had attacked Earth before, and Veltheros confirmed that they had visited every inhabited world in the galaxy at some point in their long, terrible history, and they always returned to the places they had been before because they marked their territories, and Earth was in their territory, and had been for far longer than humanity had existed as a species. The crystalline alien continued and explained that the Draketh had a kind of cultural memory too, and they would remember Earth, and when they came back in force they would not treat it as just another conquest but as the reclaiming of something they considered their own. And that was why the upcoming battle would be especially fierce and why humanity needed to be prepared for the full fury of an enemy that had existed since before the first stars formed. Kevin thanked Veltheros for the warning and returned to Lisa, who had been coordinating with various alien military commanders, and they walked back toward the transport bay in silence, until Lisa finally asked if they were doing the right thing by encouraging humanity to fight instead of evacuate, and Kevin stopped and looked out a viewport at Earth hanging in space below them, and he said that running would only delay the inevitable, and at least by fighting, they could choose how their story ended. Major Patrick Sullivan stood on the command platform overlooking the construction site where thousands of workers and automated drones assembled the Sol defense grid, and the scale of the project was staggering, with massive weapons platforms being built in orbit around Earth and Mars and the outer planets, and each platform bristled with weapons that combined human engineering with alien technology in ways that would have seemed like science fiction just 6 months ago, but now represented humanity's best hope for survival against an enemy that had conquered countless worlds. Captain Olivia Chen joined him on the platform with a datapad showing construction progress and power consumption statistics, and she reported that the mass driver arrays were now operational at 70% capacity, which meant they could accelerate tungsten rods to 95% of light speed and turn them into kinetic weapons that would hit with the force of nuclear bombs. And the Luminari had provided the energy matrices that made such power possible, and human engineers had scaled them up beyond what the aliens thought feasible. Patrick asked about the biological weapons research because he knew that conventional weapons alone would not be enough against an enemy that could regenerate from almost any injury. And Olivia's expression grew grim as she explained that Dr. Sarah Mitchell had been working around the clock with xenobiologists from 6 different species to find exploitable weaknesses in Draketh physiology, and the work was dangerous because they were essentially trying to create diseases that could kill creatures from another dimension. Down in the research facility beneath the lunar surface, Sarah Mitchell stared at the holographic display showing the cellular structure of a Draketh tissue sample, and after months of analysis, she had finally found something promising, and the creatures had a symbiotic relationship with a parasitic organism that enhanced their regeneration abilities and made them nearly impossible to kill through conventional means. But the parasite itself was vulnerable to certain viral agents, and if they could engineer a virus to target the parasite, then the Draketh would lose their healing factor. Sarah called her team together and explained her findings, and they began working on prototypes immediately. And the process involved combining Earth viruses with alien pathogens and genetic material from 12 different species, and it was complicated and risky. And there was no guarantee it would work outside of laboratory simulations, but they had to try, because millions of lives depended on finding a way to kill these monsters efficiently. Meanwhile, on Earth's surface at Fort Armstrong in the Arizona desert, Sergeant Ryan Cooper drilled the 1st Battalion of the Interspecies Defense Force, and the training ground was filled with humans and luminary warriors and architect combat, drones and reptilian Essiskar shock troops all learning to fight together as a unified force. And the challenges were enormous because each species had different physical capabilities and communication methods and tactical doctrines. But Ryan was determined to forge them into an effective fighting unit. He shouted orders as plasma fire streaked across the training field from automated turrets, and the mixed species squad had to work together to reach the objective. And Private Nicole Adams dove behind cover with her pulse rifle and the enhanced targeting systems the architects had installed in her helmet, highlighted enemy positions and weak points. And beside her, a luminary warrior named Kethros channeled energy through his crystalline hands, creating shields that protected the advancing squad from incoming fire. During a break in training, Kethros commented that humans were strange because they should be terrified of the coming battle. But instead they joked and laughed and seemed almost excited at the prospect of combat. And Nicole grinned and explained that Earth had been trying to kill humanity for millions of years, through diseases and disasters and predators and climate shifts, and if their own planet could not wipe them out, then some space monsters certainly were not going to finish the job. High above Earth's atmosphere, the orbital shipyards worked continuously without pause, and Commander Alex Turner supervised the construction of the Titan-class warships that would form the backbone of humanity's defense fleet. And these vessels were unlike anything built before because they incorporated technologies from 20 different species and created something entirely new and potentially powerful enough to actually damage the Draketh. The first ship to be completed was christened the Defiance, and it was a massive, ungainly-looking vessel that combined human durability with luminary energy weapons and architect structural integrity, and it carried plasma cannons and dimensional disruptors and biological payload launchers and old-fashioned nuclear missiles, because the design philosophy was to throw everything possible at the enemy and see what worked. Chief Engineer Danny Roberts stood beside Alex in the observation bay looking at the Defiance, and he said it was the ugliest ship he had ever seen, and Alex laughed and corrected him, saying it was beautiful because every bolt and wire and weapon system represented humanity's refusal to surrender, and their determination to fight back against impossible odds and make the monsters regret ever coming to this part of space. The war was already spreading beyond the Sol system, and reports came in daily of Draketh attacks on allied colonies and trading posts, and the creatures were claiming systems and turning planets into nightmare hive worlds that spawned more horrors, and every world lost meant more enemies to fight later. And the clock was ticking toward a confrontation that would decide the fate of multiple civilizations. Admiral Claire Foster gathered the combined fleet commanders in a secure briefing room, and the holographic display showed the strategic situation across multiple star systems. And the news was not good, because the Draketh were advancing on all fronts and the Allied forces were trading space for time, while they built up their strength and prepared for the major battles that were coming. Claire explained that intelligence suggested the Draketh were gathering their forces for a major assault on a critical Allied position in the Theta Persei system, and if that system fell, it would open a direct route to Earth and several other heavily populated worlds, and they could not allow that to happen, which meant the combined fleet would have to engage the enemy there and hold the line no matter the cost. She looked around the room at the faces of commanders from a dozen different species, and she saw fear and determination mixed together, and she told them honestly that many would not be coming back from this battle, but those who survived would know they had saved billions of lives and protected their homes from an ancient evil, and that was worth any sacrifice. The fleet began assembling near the Mars orbital yards, and it was the largest gathering of military spacecraft in human history, with 300 ships of various designs and sizes, from nimble fighters to massive capital ships, and mixed in among the human vessels were alien warships that had been hiding for centuries, but were now joining the fight. And the sight of so many different species working together gave hope to those who had feared this war was unwinnable. Ryan Cooper and his battalion boarded troop transports bound for the fleet, because ground forces would be needed if the Draketh managed to establish beachheads on any planets or stations, and he gathered his people together before departure and told them that they had trained hard and were ready for whatever came next, and the humans and aliens under his command looked nervous, but determined, and that was all he could ask for. Nicole Adams checked her equipment one final time and made sure her pulse rifle was properly calibrated and her armor seals were tight, and she thought about her family back on Earth and hoped she would see them again, but knew the odds were not great. And she had written letters to her parents and younger brother just in case she did not return, and those letters sat in her locker waiting to be delivered if the worst happened. Sarah Mitchell finally completed the bioweapon and loaded it into special warheads that would be carried by the Defiance, and the virus had tested successfully in simulations against Draketh tissue samples, but there was no way to know if it would work in actual combat conditions against living targets, and she worried that they might have missed something critical in their research. But time had run out, and they had to deploy what they had. Patrick Sullivan watched from the command center as the last defensive platforms came online, and the Sol defense grid was now fully operational and capable of putting out enough firepower to vaporize small moons, and he hoped it would be enough to protect Earth if the fleet failed at Theta Persei and the Draketh came here. But deep down he knew that if the enemy reached Earth in force, then all the weapons in the system might not be sufficient. Alex Turner took command of the Defiance and ran the ship through final systems checks, and everything showed green across the board, and the crew was as ready as they would ever be, and he opened a shipwide channel and told them that they were about to head into battle carrying a weapon that might change the course of the war, and their mission was critical, and he had complete faith in their abilities and professionalism. The combined fleet received the order to jump to hyperspace, and one by one the ships engaged their faster-than-light drives and disappeared in flashes of light heading toward the Theta Persei system, where a Draketh invasion. Commander Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of his flagship Resolute and watched the tactical display update with enemy positions, and the Draketh force was massive and spread across the system like a dark cancer, and he knew that the battle about to begin would determine whether the allied species could actually stand against this ancient threat, or if they were about to be swept away like so many civilizations before them. And he took a deep breath and gave the order to advance into combat. Formation. The Allied fleet moved forward in a coordinated pattern that had been practiced dozens of times, with human ships forming the center of the formation and alien vessels covering the flanks and providing specialized support, and the Defiance held back slightly because its mission was too important to risk in the initial engagement, and it needed to survive long enough to deliver the bioweapon payload to the heart of the enemy fleet. The Draketh responded to the Allied advance by launching swarms of their smaller bioships, and the creatures poured out of the larger vessels, like insects boiling from a disturbed nest, and they moved with terrifying speed and coordination that suggested a hive mind connection, and within minutes the space between the two fleets was filled with weapons fire and explosions, and dying ships from both sides. Jake ordered all ships to execute Battle Formation Omega, which concentrated firepower on the largest Draketh vessels, while point defense systems handled the smaller attackers and human plasma cannons, combined with luminary energy beams to tear into the organic hulls of enemy ships, and for the first few minutes it seemed like the plan was working, and several major Draketh vessels were destroyed and tumbled through space trailing gore and debris. But then the enemy adapted, and the Draketh ships began moving in new patterns that made them harder to target, and they focused their attacks on isolated Allied vessels, and quickly overwhelmed them before help could arrive. And Jake watched his tactical display light up with casualty reports and distress signals, and he realized the enemy was learning their tactics in real time and adjusting faster than seemed possible. Aboard the Defiance, Commander Alex Turner monitored the battle from a safe distance, and he could see the Allied fleet being slowly ground down by superior numbers and adapting enemy tactics, and he contacted Jake on a secure channel and asked if it was time to make their move. And Jake studied the tactical situation and told him to wait because the Draketh were not fully committed yet, and they needed the perfect moment to strike. Dr. Sarah Mitchell worked in the Defiance's science lab, making final adjustments to the bioweapon warheads, and the virus she had created was humanity's best chance to hurt the Draketh in a meaningful way. But it had to be delivered to the right target, and she had been analyzing the enemy fleet composition, looking for some kind of command structure or central coordination point, and finally, she found something unusual buried in the sensor data. Sarah called Alex on the internal comm and explained that there was a massive structure at the center of the Draketh formation that was putting out strange energy readings, and it appeared to be coordinating the movements of all the other ships and creatures, and if her analysis was correct, it was some kind of hive node or command nexus, and if they could destroy it, the enemy fleet should lose cohesion and become disorganized. Alex immediately relayed this information to Jake, who studied the tactical display and saw what Sarah had identified, and it was protected by layers of Draketh ships and would be nearly impossible to reach. But if they could take it out, the entire battle might turn in their favor, and he made the decision to commit everything to this one desperate gamble, because they were losing the conventional fight anyway. The order went out across the Allied fleet, and every ship that could still fight turned toward the center of the Draketh formation and began a coordinated assault with all weapons firing, and the concentrated firepower carved a path through the enemy lines, but the cost was terrible, and ships were being destroyed faster than Jake could process, and he watched good people die to create an opening for the Defiance to exploit. Alex saw his chance and ordered maximum acceleration, and the Defiance surged forward with its engines pushed far beyond safe limits, and Danny Roberts worked frantically in engineering to keep the reactor from melting down, while routing every spare bit of power to the shields because the ship was taking massive damage from Draketh weapons, and hull breaches were being reported on multiple decks, but they kept going because stopping meant death and failure. Lieutenant Amy Sanders managed communications and damage control from her station, and she coordinated repair teams and tried to keep the internal systems functioning, but it was like trying to hold back a flood with her bare hands, and every time one problem was fixed, two more appeared, and she could hear the fear in the voices of the crew over the comm channels. But nobody was giving up or abandoning their posts. The Defiance broke through the Draketh defensive perimeter, and suddenly they had a clear shot at the hive node, and Alex ordered the bio-weapon launchers armed, and Sarah confirmed that all warheads were ready, and the targeting solution was locked. And this was the moment everything had been leading toward. And if the weapon failed, then all the sacrifice and death would have been for nothing. But before they could fire, the Draketh seemed to realize what was happening, and every enemy ship in range turned their weapons on the Defiance, and the assault was overwhelming, and the shields collapsed under the sustained barrage, and hull plating began to vaporize, and internal explosions rocked the ship, and crew members were dying, and Alex knew they only had seconds before the ship was destroyed completely. He shouted for Sarah to launch immediately, and she released all the bioweapon warheads at once, and they streaked toward the hive node, and Alex ordered emergency evasion, but the ship's engines were barely responding, and they were caught in the enemy crossfire with nowhere to go, and he opened a ship-wide channel and told everyone it had been an honor to serve with them. The warheads impacted the hive node and detonated in a sequence that released the engineered virus directly into the structure's organic core, and for a moment, nothing seemed to happen, and Jake, watching from the Resolute, thought they had failed, and the sacrifice had been wasted. But then the hive node began to pulse with sickly light, and convulsions ran through its massive form. The virus spread through the Draketh network faster than anyone had predicted, because the hive-mind connection that made them so coordinated also provided a perfect transmission vector, and across the battlefield enemy warriors and bioships began to show signs of distress as the parasite organisms that gave them regeneration started dying, and without their healing factor, the Draketh were suddenly vulnerable to conventional weapons. Jake saw the change immediately on his tactical display, and he ordered all Allied ships to press the attack and exploit the enemy's confusion, and human vessels that had been barely holding on now surged forward with renewed aggression, and their weapons that had seemed ineffective before were now causing serious damage, because Draketh wounds were no longer healing. The Defiance was still alive somehow despite massive damage, and Alex managed to maneuver away from the center of the enemy formation and limp toward friendly lines, and his ship was held together by emergency force fields and crew determination. But they had accomplished their mission and changed the course of the battle. Ryan Cooper and his Marines were fighting boarding parties that had breached the hull of a damaged cruiser, and the Draketh warriors that had seemed unstoppable before were now bleeding from their wounds and staying down when shot. And Ryan realized the bioweapon was working, and he rallied his troops and pushed the enemy back toward their entry point and sealed the breach. Nicole Adams fired her pulse rifle in controlled bursts, and her targeting computer highlighted the weak points in Draketh armor, and she could see her rounds actually causing lasting damage instead of being regenerated away in seconds, and the difference was dramatic. And for the first time since the battle started, she believed they might actually win. The Draketh fleet began to withdraw, and it was not an organized retreat, but rather a panicked flight as individual ships broke formation and tried to escape. And Jake ordered pursuit, but also cautioned his commanders not to overextend, because the enemy might be trying to lure them into a trap. But the withdrawal appeared genuine, and the ancient monsters that had terrorized the galaxy for millions of years were actually running away from humans and their allies. The Battle of Theta Persei lasted 3 days in total, and by the end the Allied fleet had suffered terrible casualties with over 40% of their ships destroyed or too damaged to continue fighting. But the Draketh had lost even more, and their invasion of the system had been stopped, and the hive node that coordinated their forces had been destroyed, and most importantly, The bioweapon had proven effective against their regeneration abilities. Jake stood on the bridge of the Resolute and looked at the casualty lists and felt the weight of all those deaths pressing on his conscience. And he knew every name on those lists represented someone's child or parent or loved one who would never come home. But he also knew their sacrifice had bought time for humanity and the allied species to prepare better defenses and develop more effective weapons. 8 months after the victory at Theta Persei, the Draketh launched their assault on Earth, and it was everything the Allied intelligence had feared, and more because the enemy brought their full strength, and every ship and creature and weapon they possessed converged on the Sol system in a dark tide that seemed to blot out the stars themselves. And Admiral Claire Foster watched from Station Olympus as the sensors struggled to count the incoming hostiles because there were simply too many. The council chamber that had once been a place for diplomatic negotiations had transformed into a war room, where representatives from 23 allied species worked together in perfect coordination, because the months since Theta Persei had forged them into a true alliance bound by shared sacrifice and common purpose. And they knew this battle would decide the fate of not just Earth, but every free civilization in the galaxy. The tactical officer reported that the Draketh fleet was emerging from hyperspace in waves, and preliminary estimates suggested over 2,000 capital ships and countless smaller vessels and bioconstructs. But what made everyone in the command center fall silent was the massive anomaly appearing at the center of the enemy formation, and it was something so large that it distorted space itself and defied every law of physics. Claire demanded to know what they were seeing, and Veltharos, who had become her trusted advisor, looked at the sensor readings, and his crystalline form seemed to dim with fear as he whispered that it was the firstborn and the progenitor of all. Draketh and the ancient creature that had spawned this entire nightmare species millions of years ago, and it had been sealed away in the deepest prison the ancients could create. But somehow it had broken free. The firstborn was beyond comprehension, and its form shifted between dimensions and seemed to exist in multiple realities at once, and it was part organic and part machine, and part something else entirely that had no name in any language, and where. It moved through space. Reality itself bent and twisted, and ships that got too close simply ceased to exist as if they had been erased from the universe. Commander Jake Morrison led the main battle fleet, and he stared at the creature that should not exist and felt a primal terror rising from some deep place in his mind where ancient genetic memories lived. But he forced himself to stay calm and focus on tactics, because fear was a luxury he could not afford when billions of lives depended on his decisions. He opened a channel to all ships in the combined fleet, and his voice was steady as he gave the order to engage. And every vessel that humanity and its allies had managed to build or repair or salvage threw itself at the Draketh Armada, and the space between Earth and Mars became a battlefield unlike anything the solar system had ever witnessed. Major Patrick Sullivan coordinated the Sol defense grid from his command center, and the weapons platforms that ringed Earth and the inner planets opened fire simultaneously, and thousands of tungsten rods accelerated to near light speed and slammed into the Draketh fleet with devastating effect, and enemy ships exploded in brilliant flashes, but more kept coming. And for every one destroyed, 2 more took its place. On Earth's surface, Lieutenant Nicole Adams and Sergeant Ryan Cooper prepared ground defenses because some Draketh had broken through the orbital blockade and were making atmospheric entry, and the creatures that crashed into mountains and forests and oceans were nightmares made flesh that had haunted humanity's collective unconscious for 100,000 years. And now they were real and hungry, and coming for the cities. Ryan coordinated battalions of tanks and infantry that had been modified with alien energy weapons, and the combined human and alien ground forces moved to intercept the Draketh landing sites before they could establish beachheads. And he knew that if they failed here, then Earth would fall no matter how well the space battle went. Nicole led a company of armored vehicles into the Rocky Mountains where several large Draketh had landed, and the creatures were even more terrifying up close, with multiple limbs and eyes that glowed with malevolent intelligence and mouths that could swallow vehicles whole. But she pushed down her fear and gave orders to concentrate fire on the biggest threats first. In space, Commander Alex Turner piloted the Defiance one last time, even though the ship was still carrying scars from Theta Persei, and had been patched together with parts from a dozen different vessels, and it was held together by engineering, skill and crew determination, and probably some kind of miracle. But its mission was critical, because they carried the second-generation bioweapon that Sarah Mitchell had created specifically to kill the firstborn. Sarah worked in the science lab making final adjustments, and the weapon was based on her earlier success, but amplified to target the unique biology of the progenitor Draketh, and she had increased the viral potency by a factor of 10, and added genetic material from samples they had captured after Theta Persei, but there was no way to test it because they only had one shot, and if it failed, then humanity would fall. The Defiance pushed through the chaotic battlefield, taking damage from every direction, and the shields were barely holding, and hull breaches were being reported on multiple decks, and Danny Roberts in engineering was performing miracles to keep the engines running, but he knew the ship was dying and would not survive much longer. Alex received reports that several crew members had been killed by hull breaches and fires and enemy boarding parties, but the survivors stayed at their posts because they understood that their mission was more important than their individual lives, and if they could kill the firstborn, then the Draketh might finally be defeated once and for all. Amy Sanders managed communications and tried to coordinate with the rest of the fleet, but the interference from the firstborn's reality-warping presence was disrupting all their systems, and she had to rely on backup protocols and old-fashioned radio signals, but she kept working because giving up was not an option. Jake watched from the Resolute as the Defiance made its desperate run toward the firstborn, and he ordered all available ships to provide cover fire and create a corridor through the enemy lines, but the cost was terrible, and vessels were being destroyed to buy seconds of time, and he knew he was ordering people to their deaths, but there was no other way. The firstborn seemed to notice the Defiance finally, and turned its attention toward the small ship that dared approach, and the reality around Alex's vessel began to warp and twist, and crew members reported seeing impossible things in the corridors, and hearing voices of dead friends and family, and the ship's sensors were giving readings that made no sense at all. Alex realized they would not make it close enough for a normal launch, and the firstborn's reality distortion would prevent the bioweapon from reaching its target. So he made a decision that he knew meant certain death, and he ordered all remaining crew to evacuate immediately and get to the escape pods while they still could. Danny Roberts refused to leave his post, and several other crew members made the same choice, and they told Alex that if he was staying, then so were they, and they would see this mission through together, no matter the cost, and Alex felt pride and sorrow in equal measure as he realized these people had become more than just crew. They had become family. He aimed the dying Defiance directly at the firstborn's core, where the sensors indicated the creature's central mass existed across multiple dimensions, and he diverted all remaining power to the engines, and the ship accelerated beyond its safety limits and began to come apart from the stress, but it kept going forward, driven by momentum and the will of those aboard who refused to fail. Alex spoke into the ship-wide comm one last time and told everyone that it had been the greatest honor of his life to serve with them, and humanity would remember their sacrifice forever. And then he released the bioweapon payload and rammed the Defiance directly into the firstborn at nearly the speed of light. The explosion was visible from Earth's surface, and a new star briefly appeared in the sky and burned with light that carried hope and defiance, and the bioweapon spread through the firstborn's incomprehensible biology and began to tear it apart. From the inside, and the ancient creature that had existed since before stars formed released a psychic scream that echoed across dimensions. Every Draketh in the Sol system felt their progenitor die, and the psychic connection that bound them shattered, and they began to lose coordination and fight among themselves and flee in random directions, and Jake saw the enemy fleet collapse into chaos, and he ordered all allied ships to pursue and destroy any that tried to escape. The battle continued for 3 more days as the combined fleet hunted down the scattered Draketh and prevented them from reforming or escaping to threaten other worlds. And by the end, the ancient enemy that had terrorized the galaxy for millions of years had been broken and scattered and no longer represented an organized threat. Nicole Adams stood among the wreckage of destroyed Draketh creatures in the Rocky Mountains and watched the sunrise over Earth, and she thought about all the people who had died to protect this world, and she promised herself that their sacrifice would never be forgotten. 2 weeks after the battle, Ambassador Kevin Rhodes stood in the rebuilt council chamber on Station Olympus and addressed representatives from dozens of species, and he announced that the Draketh were no longer a